Well, I just wanted to comment a little bit on this this sort of thread of conversation because I find it fascinating. And to what Joan was saying, you know, yeah, of course, we're not. That's what I tell my students. You're not going to go and play your Paganini Caprice, and then you know, people are going to say, "Well, jolly good," you know, that was really in tune, and you know, you want to actually move people with this virtuosity and showing them what the instrument can do, right? But to do that, you need to have means to an end. Otherwise, you are what I call, you know, you become a victim of your talent, and that can be, you know, if we just look at the case of Sir or Lord Yehudi Menuhin, right? And he, you know, here's a guy who has such depthness of emotion and then such natural talent for motor skills that he could just play anything. You know, by the age of 10, he played all the major concertos with all around the world. And then he got into his 30s, and he said himself that he realized that he doesn't know how to play violin, right? And I mean, I'm convinced to this day that he was doing a lot of things wrong, but because his body was so young, he didn't feel it. So he suffered neurological damage, right? So at the end, it didn't matter that he had so much to say, you know, emotionally and musically, but he got to the point where his body couldn't execute it, right? And as humans, of course, we need to be able to do both, right? Because you know, Joan, of course, she's listened to so many orchestra auditions and so many players, and you can, and competitions that I've listened to, you know, and you can see that, you know, there's certain kind of playing when you realize, you know, there's nothing really to complain about. It's in tune, it's with beautiful sound, it's phrased. But at the end of the day, there's nothing memorable about it. You feel like, is this person telling us something emotionally? What is art really about? So for me, the answer to that question is yes. You of course, we play music and art because we want to express ourselves. But what Alison is saying is we need to have means to do it, because if we don't have the means to do it, it does not matter what we have to say and express, because we're never going to be able to express it. And likewise, you know, all those poor kids that are made to practice 8 hours a day when they're 4, you know, and then they go, ironically, you know, win these competitions when they're 10. But do they have a story to tell when they're 27? Did they live? So you know, it's funny, right? Because it's a difficult balance. I'm going to Gab and you give it to, well,
well, I think there's some interesting things that you raise in that. Firstly, the thing about Menuhin. Yes, apparently he was told, his mother was told by somebody that he needed to go and have lessons with, I forget who he was with now, Persinger, I think, and Persinger didn't teach technique. And apparently his mother didn't want to do that because she wanted to be able to take Yehudi around and sort of display how wonderful he was. I think there's also an interesting element in that his is an extreme case, but there are lots of people you can think about who, when you look at them playing now compared to when they were kids, it's obviously much more difficult for them. So an example is Sarah Chang. You know, if you look at her playing when she was 5 years old, there's a YouTube of her playing Saint-Saëns in a kiddies thing, and you're thinking, how the hell does somebody who's 5 years old learn, you know, how can they play like that? And then you look at her at 10 and you're thinking, how does she do it? And then you're looking at her now, I think she's early 40s now. She moves around a lot. She's still phenomenal, but it obviously costs her a lot more. Hilary Hahn is the same. She does a lot more moving around and looks a lot less comfortable. But there are a lot of people like that. And you have to ask yourself, well, why is that? Why do they find it harder? And then I'm sure that you know people in the profession who, when they get to my sort of age, I'm 60 in 2 months, they're thinking about giving up because it's too hard. And so there are people who retire because they just cannot do what they used to do when they're younger. And I think that is partly because our use becomes worse as we get older, unless we have a way around it. So there are a lot of people who have really good use when they're young for doing certain things. When we're kids, we learn by trial and error. And if you think about it, there's one way of doing anything with just the right amount of effort and no more. But there's lots of ways of doing something using more effort than we need to. So any learning always involves trial and error. I think you said earlier that, you know, you just kind of pick up the violin and you sort of do it, and the the way is, just copy what I do. You watch people, you watch your teacher, and they tell you what to do, and you sort of copy it, and maybe it goes okay. But if you learn to do something, there's a good chance just trying it by trial and error. A small child, it learns by trial and error how to stand up, and it stops worrying about it. When it stops falling over, then it's learned to stand up. So it then goes on to the next thing. We also tend to react to unpleasant stimuli. So if you watch a small child and they have, I don't know, they're plonked in a high chair or something, or they have a toy taken off them, they'll react, they'll stiffen all over, they'll maybe scream and cry, but you can usually distract them pretty quickly. You give them something else and it's gone, all that tension's gone. But as we get older and older and older, we react to more and more things. There are more and more, if you like, unpleasant stimuli that we react to. We go to school and have to interact with other kids, and we have to gradually take more and more responsibility for ourselves. So the opportunities to let go of that tension that we create when we react are fewer and far between. So we just hold on to it more and more. And so everything we learn gradually becomes superimposed onto that, if you like, that base level of stiffening. So over time, our use gets worse and worse. And again, I've had the experience of, and you might have had this experience as well, if I'm teaching conservatoire students, a bit of handwork and some verbal input and watching each other and explanation, a lot of them improve really, really quickly. And they're really quite flexible. You get somebody of 40 or 50 or older, and they're much more fixed in every way. They're more fixed mentally, obviously, but they're also more fixed physically. So that means that their balance and coordination is adversely affected, because that's what misuse does. If you're using more effort than you need to, it's pulling you out of shape, taking you away from your best configuration. And that means your coordination is affected. So as you get older, maybe you'll find things more difficult. So that's my theory on why a lot of people find it harder as they get older to do something that they found very easy when they were younger. But I often wonder how the Alexander technique would have benefited somebody like Menuhin, or how it would benefit some of the people that we observe playing now.
Alexander had the exact same theory, and that was why he suggested to teach Alexander technique in elementary school, and to start early on and to become aware of how we move and how we think when we move, to explore these patterns of better use and misuse. And he spoke a lot about imitation and about figuring out what you do and how to improve it. And I agree with you that people are more stiff at 40 and might have a hard time changing their thoughts, but have a deeper understanding and more things to say. So I think it's a balancing act. I think it's great to work with kids, but it's also great to work with adults. And I think our approach, if we use Alexander's principles, will vary depending on who we work with. The last thing that I want to say, and then I'd like each one of you to say whatever you like, is that I would hope that when you speak with non-Alexander teachers and you don't want to use jargon, which I understand, that you make a reference to these concepts that are embedded in Alexander's way of thinking and Alexander's concepts and principles of education and how we teach. They didn't come out of thin air. And so without jargon, but with acknowledging what the framework is.
Yeah, well, I think the way I teach is different from the experiment. I didn't use jargon in the experiment and in the thesis, and I haven't in the reports I've written. But when I give a talk, what I do is I try and introduce the Alexander technique. I explain. I mean, I do it differently depending on who the audience is, just as you do with a student. But I try and give an overview of what the problem is, what the Alexander technique is and what the problem is, and how we solve, how it comes about and how we solve it. And I don't use jargon straight away, but I do gradually introduce it. So at the Conservatoire, I run a course, and the talks are introductory courses with, an introductory talk with some demonstration where the students play like a practical game where they begin to see for themselves what I'm talking about. And I gradually introduce the terms. I don't call them jargon, I call them terms. You know, if we say a word like habit, you have to explain it because we all have a connotation of what habit is. Definitely. Before we even get to the Alexander technique. So I always try and explain what I'm saying.
Joan, final thought, question, comment?
Oh, I have all sorts of thoughts going on in my mind. It was very interesting to hear. I have a feeling, Dom, we might be having a couple of conversations. I'm really interested. And it's very interesting to hear you talk, Alison. And I just wanted to say to you, this whole idea of you know, not playing well enough, I think that's one of the problems, because so when we're thinking this way, we're so busy thinking about doing it right, then we don't worry about, is it good enough? So I love that.
It's great to talk to people who are open-minded, right? And you know, that we all acknowledge that there's a lot to learn, right? The more you know, the more you don't know. I mean, when it comes to perfectionism, I have the same problem. You know, lately I've been trying to use I think it's the Rousseau's quote that the perfect is the enemy of good, as my mantra. So I mean, I hope, Alison, that you take this further. I love that there's a scientific sort of proof to this, and you know, it's almost like, you know, if you have a violin student and you start talking about violin technique, right? You can sort of have them read this, so then they can start believing you, right?
Yeah.
In what you're saying, you know, I feel what it dealt with in terms of Alexander technique and violin playing is inhibition, which is a big part of it. I often joke when my students tell me, or the parents, oh, you know, thank you for teaching my kid, it's so great. And I joke, well, you know, I basically just tell them what not to do, right? So, and that's a big part of it. But that being said, I find that after that inhibition, and, you know, again, when I read your research of you basically, you know, telling, okay, well, don't move your shoulder, don't do this and that. And that's a great start. I feel the next step with this is sort of trying to find a sort of a replacement behavior, so to say, right? Because as we all know, once all the bad habits that we have actually end up having a use in our violin playing, right? And then once you eliminate those, then we can't play at all. So we have to find something else, you know. And that's been a big part of my journey, you know, thinking, well, you know, I shouldn't do this. Well, but if I don't do this, I can't play. So what else can I do, right? And I mean, I guess that's a topic for another conversation. Otherwise, we'll be here until midnight.
Well, I just add something to add. I'm aware of the time, but you're talking about things coming out of lockdown. When we first went into lockdown and the idea of teaching on the technique online, I sort of inwardly laughed. And then actually it became a reality with my conservatoire students. But it is interesting that it seems to have had quite a lot of success working online with violin students and my other students on how do they play their instruments. So, you know, so if anybody wants to sort of do work on that a bit more online, then you know, feel free to get in touch. So.
Well, what I want to say about that, I mean, I was one of the people who said I'll never teach online, and I actually ended up teaching online and enjoying it to some degree. It doesn't really replace hands-on, but I like the combination, and I like the things that have opened up. But when I think about the two of you, Domago and Joan, as students, as I said at the outset, you're really curious. So, I mean, you both know how many explorations and experiments you've done following our lessons, whether it's setting up a set of mirrors or videotaping yourselves and really understanding how you move and how you play, and then unpacking it to create new ways of finding supports. And whether you do it completely on your own or in collaboration with your Alexander teacher, I think that's the journey.
I just think doing it on your own, it's harder because you don't know what you're looking for.
That's right. That's right. That's why I have a job.
Yeah. I spend a lot of time looking. I had a mirror propped up behind me on a chair and one to the side. So I spent a lot of time looking at what was going on and trying to work out how I could actually just put the violin up, work out what I needed in terms of chin, shoulder rest, where the violin needed to go, and how I could do with that without raising my shoulder, because I couldn't not get that arm in. I just couldn't leave that arm alone. It took me a long time. So, and over, you know, so it is good if somebody can do it with even
Absolutely.
And if you can record the lesson, of course, they've got the record as well. So
That's right.
yeah.
Well, I just want to say thank you. And sometimes there's a online dialogue that follows when things come up, and just I'm looking forward to more questions and more interactions and more conversations, and you know, to be continued. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure.